Some thoughts on temporary ordination. Some time ago I met a person, and we were talking, and he mentioned to me that he'd been a monk. And I was really quite surprised because he seemed to be quite young. Anyway, so I asked him, well, how long were you a monk for? And he said, 2 days. And I said, I found that rather surprising. Anyway, so he had undergone what has come to be called temporary ordination. And I'd like to share with you some of my thoughts on this practice. But before we do that, we have to say at least something about the whole concept of ordination in Buddhism. So after the Buddha was enlightened, after he attained Bodhi, full awakening, he saw the need to establish a community of monks, and in order to create the optimum community in which men could work towards the goal of Buddhism, which is full enlightenment, full awakening. And that community would also be in a good position to be able to communicate the Dhamma to others. So this community would be the optimum community to do your practice, simply because you would have far less worldly preoccupations, and you would be free from the expectations of society. You would have the bare minimum of personal possessions, and this would really free you up. And secondly, if you had no family ties and property that had to be protected and what have you and that, you would be able to travel widely because you'd have few obligations, or you don't have to stay in a particular place to guard your property. And hopefully you would have more knowledge and understanding that you could share with others. So the word for ordination in Buddhism was pabbajja, which means, it literally means to go forward, which is quite a good word. So it means to let go of things so that you could move forward and upward in a spiritual sense. To move away from and forward, away from worldly concerns and possessions, and upward to the goals of the Dhamma. And that was generally what happened. So a community was formed. It came to be called the Sangha, which pretty much means community. And then sometime later, the opportunity was given for women to do the same thing, so that they could be free from housework and children and husbands and what have you, and they could spend much more of their time practicing the Dhamma. And so it continued for many, many centuries. Then as Buddhism spread to other countries and it evolved, sometimes it adopted some of the customs and traditions of the cultures in which it came to and what have you. And then in some parts of the Buddhist world, the tradition of what was called temporary ordination developed. And so today, in countries like Burma, Thailand, Laos, you have this tradition of people becoming monks for short periods of time. This is certainly not a tradition in Sri Lanka. Then generally there it is thought that you commit yourself. It's a lifetime commitment, not a part-time commitment. It's the same in Tibetan tradition, and it used to be pretty much the same in the Chinese tradition also. So this is more a cultural practice than a practice that comes from Buddhism. Now the interesting thing is, a lot of people don't know this, but there was a tradition of temporary ordination at the time of the Buddha. Yes, it's a fact. So the Niganthas, what we now call the Jains, they had a tradition where they would ask, or they would recommend their lay disciples to become a Jain ascetic for a day. So in the Anguttara Nikaya, the Buddha mentions this practice. He says that the Niganthas tell their disciples, take off all your clothes, put aside all your possessions, eat from your hands rather than from a plate or a bowl, sleep on the ground, etc. And tomorrow morning, put on your clothes again and go about your work. And the Buddha was quite critical of this practice. In actual fact, he says, and it's in the Anguttara Nikaya, to say that they are ascetics is little more than a lie. So he thought, amongst the Jains at least, that this was not necessarily a particularly good thing. However, in the cultures where this is a practice, we need to look at it. So in Thailand, I have been told that every male is expected to become a monk for a short period. Sometimes it's just a few weeks, sometimes it's even just a few days, sometimes it's for a month or two. Apparently during the school holidays, a young lad will become a monk for 3 weeks or something like that. And the interesting thing is, at least I have been told, this is expected of a male because he's believed not to be fully mature until he has done this. And it's a sort of a rite de passage for his adulthood, that he shouldn't get married until he has done this. And that the purpose of it is to create merit, or to make merit, so that you can transfer that merit to your parents as a way of thanking them, or as an expression of gratitude for all the difficulties they went through to bring you up. I think that's a rather lovely custom, where you do something in order to repay your parents. I think that is a rather beautiful custom. Apparently there's something similar in Burma and in Laos. So it is certainly a meaningful and important social practice, but it's really not what the Buddha envisaged. As we said before, pabbaja, or going forth, the purpose of this was not to repay anybody, but to leave everything behind, to simplify your life, okay? To give up everything so that you could focus totally on one thing. So this cultural practice, while it might have its positive sides, is quite different from what the Buddha envisaged. However, that's just the way that it's done. Now, since the last 20 or 30 years, maybe a little more than that, the Thai monks travelling to different parts of the world as teaching Buddhism, they have introduced the practice of temporary ordination in quite a lot of countries. I believe there have been some examples that even in Australia, and I know that there are some places in Malaysia that they do it, and I've met some people who have undergone this practice. And quite a few years ago I was in KL here, in a large temple, where they had just had a temporary ordination period, where it was about 40 young men became monks. They were ordained for a certain period of time. I think it was 2 weeks, something like that. And during that time there were some Dhamma classes and they were taught some chanting and what have you. And I was there for the whole time. And I noticed that some of the young men seemed to, try to calm down, spend more time meditating and what have you. And others, it seemed to be, for them at least, mainly photo ops. Their relatives were coming and they were posing for photographs, and it looked like they were having a good time, and good luck to them. Others seemed to take it a little bit more seriously. Okay? But it made me wonder, did it really have much of an effect on them? Was it a good introduction to the monastic life? But I also wondered, did they give up anything other than their clothes for a few weeks? Did they give up their toys, their cars, their bicycles, their bank account? I'm pretty sure that they didn't. So if the original purpose of ordination was to give up everything, and in actual fact you are temporarily ordained with the intention of becoming a layman again in 3 weeks' time or a month's time, have you fulfilled the central goal of that practice? I think that this is a question that needs to be considered. I have seen temporary ordination activities in other places too. 1 or 2 places where I saw it, I got this distinct impression that the intention behind it was not to give a good introduction to a group of young men for what the monk's life involves, but to collect donations. I couldn't but help notice that money, in actual fact, quite large amounts of money, changed hands. And that made me feel very sorry. And I couldn't but help notice that the temporary monks really didn't do very much. They just loitered around the temple, they did some cleaning up, they learnt a few things by heart, and that was about it. So I think that this sometimes happens. And I think it's perhaps, once again, a question that we should give some thought to. And then I thought, well, could young men, and perhaps nowadays young women too, have an introduction to the life of simplicity, in the Buddhist sense, without becoming monks? For example, could they undertake, or rather than undergoing fake pabbaja, because if you've given up nothing, it really isn't pabbaja, I wonder if they could perhaps undertake to practice the 10 precepts for 3 weeks, to abandon their clothing, put on white clothes, and undertake the 10 precepts for 10 days. In that 10 days, or that 3 weeks or something, could they be taught chanting and taught some discourses, ate less, remained silent more, had some good instruction to meditation and Dhamma and the life of simplicity and discipline? Could they do that and benefit from it without necessarily putting on a yellow robe? And I thought, yeah, that could be really, that could, if it was done properly. And I thought, even if you had temporary ordination with a robe on, if in the time you remained a temporary monk, and there was a really good, carefully thought out and developed program of Dhamma learning, a basic introduction to meditation, well, that could be very helpful too. And even though it wouldn't really be a genuine ordination, for the reasons that I just said, it could still be quite fruitful for them, for the participants. But best of all would be the 10 precepts one. So just because some practices are done in traditional Buddhist countries, it doesn't mean that we should practice them. There are traditions in Buddhist countries which are very firmly and deeply rooted in what things that the Buddha taught. And there are some that are not. They have evolved in different ways for different reasons. And simply because temporary ordination is done in some cultures, it doesn't mean that we have to do it exactly the same in another culture. Perhaps we could evolve another way of doing it. So these are just some thoughts I'd like to share with you on the practice of temporary ordination.